Hello, everyone. I'm Denton Davidson, senior editor for Gold Derby, here with Sebastian Stan, who plays rock and roll icon and Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee in the Hulu limited series Pam and Tommy. Sebastian, thanks for joining me today. And I want to start off just by asking, what was the most intimidating thing about taking on this role of Tommy Lee and telling us a story about that's centered on a sex tape, but it really was so much more than that?
Yeah, well, I don't play the drums. I don't play any instrument. So that part of it was definitely, I think, very scary. I sort of started taking drum lessons, I think in really January, about 2.5 months before we started. We started in April, and while I was shooting another project, so I was doing that on the weekends and then kind of building up to it. And I just think everything about it was terrifying. I mean, it felt like big shoes to fill on every level, personality wise, certainly reputation wise. You can argue on a musical career. The whole look of it, sort of whether it was going to be believable, if anybody was going to buy it. I mean, I don't have any tattoos on my body, so it's just the idea of even just going there was sort of terrifying. I think until that initial camera test, both she and I were kind of holding on for dear life, sort of hoping it was going to work, and unfortunately it did. And yeah, it's what you said. I think at first it definitely feels like, oh, the sex tape is sort of the easiest way to kind of the easiest thing to point the finger to. But then as you kind of peel it apart, you realize there's all these other layers to it, and there's something extremely timely about it. And this sort of celebrity obsession that kind of really started kicking up to a different level in the 90s, and how that's really percolated all the way to today, including the loss of privacy and how we're all affected by the internet and the parts that we play in it anonymously, and how the parts that the media play into it as well, and shaping narratives often that are not true. And yes, you had two larger than life characters who were very popular at the very height of their times, specifically her because of Baywatch, and who collided in this intense kind of connection, but then who were really the victims of a crime, essentially, because someone did break into the house, stole private property, released it without their consent, and then try to make profit out of it. Right. So it's a lot to unpack, but I think fortunately it feels like it's landed with people in the right way.
And when you're playing someone that's real, so you've played a real person before. You played Jeff Gillooly in I, Tonya.
Right.
He's not a Tommy Lee though. So when you're playing someone that's so well known, is that more difficult for you to prepare for? Do you have to watch a lot of interviews, or how does that?
Yeah, I mean, both. It was just nonstop. I mean, it was just literally every waking hour was listening, on AirPods to a 2-hour compilation of interviews that I have put together off of YouTube, dating all the way back to the 80s, up to today. Anything I could find on him, and Lily was doing the same thing. Even in between takes, I would show up in the morning, and they would take 2.5 hours to put these tattoos on. And I would just be sitting there listening to his voice, and just to get the rhythm, the cadence of the way he spoke. And it starts out like in a very technical way, because it was sort of kind of just trying to mimic things. And then eventually, once you keep doing the work, it sort of hopefully seeps into you at a point where you're not conscious of it, and it just happens in a moment. But and also there was an energy factor to it. I mean, he was always at a level 10, no matter what. That's how he was written in the scripts. And if you look at the interviews, it almost feels like he's always listening to a piece of music, or he's constantly almost at the drums, even when he's not playing. Um, and fortunately, one thing that I did that helped me out was I did try that earpiece device, and I had throughout the scenes, and I would just always have music playing in my head, you know, even while we were doing things. So there were some tricks, you know, there were some things that you kind of learn, rely on, whatever, to kind of get you there. But it is tough because it's not you, and you're handed a life, and you know, you're sort of told, go and fit into that somehow, and you don't always know if you will or not.
And Tommy and Pam had such, you know, a heated physical relationship, and you're just meeting Lily James. Is that difficult or awkward to get into that right away, or how do you sort of navigate that?
I think it's about trust and it's communication. And I remember I reached out very early on, and I just said, look, you and I have to sort of be tied at the hip on this thing, and I'm here, whatever I can do to help guide us along, and I'm looking to you for guidance. And so unfortunately, I think we were really on the same page. I mean, obviously I'd worked with Craig before, so I knew a lot of how to communicate with him, and I knew some of the ways he was going to approach this, and that was helpful. And then the scripts were really good, so it just came down to sort of she and I really aligning ourselves and making sure that we're approaching it from the same place. And one of the things that we were both very protective of is just, regardless of how crazy things got, we would always make sure that we didn't abandon that very inherent bond, that very instinctively kind of, you know, intense connection that they developed, that never really left. And it's true, because their story continues for 8 years on and off, even after our show ends.
And you know, I spoke with Craig Gillespie, and and speaking of the script, he was talking about, you know, that scene everyone's buzzing about where Tommy's talking to his own penis. I mean,
Right.
it keeps coming up. But when you read the script, were you sort of like, is this really going to happen? Like, did you actually imagine that there would be this prosthetic talking back to you, or did you just think you'd be looking down, or how did you imagine that would go versus how it actually went?
Well, first of all, I just want to point out one thing that's really interesting, right? That this scene does keep coming up a lot, and you just sort of see where our attention goes, right? We love to be drawn to the thing that feels a little like salacious and dirty and whatever, and yet there's all these other pieces to it, you know, to the show and everything. But and that's one of the things that the show is trying to explore and to show about us as an audience, that what we tend to kind of gravitate to right off the bat. But inherently, that scene is, you know, it's just like a confession to a friend. I mean, that's how I approached it, and that's how it was written. It's what you see is word for word what was on the page, in a very clever, creative way, honoring kind of what's in his book, you know, in his book, where he talks about having conversations with his penis very, very often. And it was so effective in the book. And I think to some extent it became effective in the script too, because we don't know we have no idea. We just have the research and details that they've spoken about in the book, in the Rolling Stone article, of what that experience was, what that weekend must have been. So I think the writers were really clever in kind of writing that scene in a way that feels almost surrealistic, to capture the intensity of what that bond was, or how strongly he felt for her. But I didn't know if it was going to work. None of us knew if it was going to work until they finally had the whole edit of the movie, of the episode. And then fortunately it still made sense. But it was just, it was like, it was me and like 4 to 5 other men, and like electric cables, and like a puppeteer. And like, I mean, that just was just a whole Cirque du Soleil, basically, you know, uh, kind of experience.
Uh,
Very
you've
little
gotten,
CGI. Yeah.
but you've gotten to know Tommy Lee a little bit, so he doesn't seem like someone who would hold back his opinion if he had a negative one. Is it nerve-wracking to meet individuals? You know, he wasn't portrayed as an angel by any means in this series. So, you know, what is it like to have conversations with the real person, whether it's him or you've met Jeff Gillooly, I understand as well. So what were those experiences like?
Well, in terms of him, for one, he knows his life. You know, I mean, he's not. There's nothing that our show sort of tries to say or hide about, you know, what's happened. I mean, he's there. He talks extensively on. You know, he's talked extensively about it, about what happened in his book and in interviews that I found that are online. About what happened, about what he, you know, what he felt he went through and some of his actions. And but I always talk about it like this. It's like, it's the closest that I would imagine to meeting like an older version of yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's really weird because you're spending months like kind of like you're like this detective slash excited kind of fan, right? Because you're like, oh my God, I'm learning this, and I'm learning this, I'm learning this. And then suddenly you come at it and you know, at the person, and you're going like, hey, by the way, remember when you did that, and remember this, and what about this, and by the way, the Sunset Strip, and did it, and they're just looking at you like, yeah, I mean, my life's very different now, you know, like I'm like, you're just suddenly, you just sort of feel a little like, oh, you feel kind of silly a little bit because it's, again, and that was the case with I, Tonya too. I mean, I just had researched everything I could possibly find for months, and every single footage I could find, everything that, you know, and then they're in front of you and you just kind of like freeze. And you just always walk away going, you can only get as close as you can. There's always going to be something you're not going to know, something you're not going to understand ultimately. And something that just doesn't belong to you, you know, it belongs to them. And but I think in terms of from a respectful place, I just always approached it that way, I guess.
And there has to be a balance, I assume, as well, of just, you don't want to do nothing but imitate them. It's a balance of, you know, what you bring to the character and the
I
like.
mean, look, I would actually probably ask you this. I'd be more curious, like, you know, what you would think. Like, for example, when you look back at certain performances, and they've been so many great performances, right? Like of biopics and things, but like the ones that really stand out to me to this day is, for example, it's like that that Joaquin Phoenix and Johnny Cash, right? Or even like Fassbender, Steve Jobs. I mean, it's like they don't, you know, they look nothing alike, but there was an essence there. There was a sort of an energy and something. And then granted, you have, you know, Gary Oldman, like as Winston Churchill. I mean, there's so many different ways of doing it, but I think it's what you said. It's not a documentary, and it can't be, and we can't own it that way. We have to, you know, I think you approach it in the sense from a creative place, and I think there's something heightened about it. I mean, I knew with Craig, right? Like Craig tonally, as we did with I, Tonya, humor was a big piece of it. And so I knew that some of the performances have to sort of like kind of lean into that a little bit tonally as well. So then it's just finding that balance. But I do believe humor sometimes, it kind of, especially if it's difficult subjects, can help get us to understand things in a certain way that, you know, as opposed to always just having a history lesson thrown at you.
Yeah. Speaking of humor, I love the tension-filled scenes with you and Seth Rogen. So what is it like, you know, going back and forth with him? Is it hard to stay in? For me, he just seems like I would naturally start laughing when he is doing them. He's a great dramatic actor as well.
No, completely. Again, somebody who I've loved so many of his movies, and so you meet someone like that, and you want to see what their process is. But he was so generous and so approachable and really sweet and thoughtful, and it's just there, on the day. And you don't always get that from other actors. You don't always get like the 100%, even when the camera's not on them and stuff. It just, and he was there, 100%. And I think he was, once that laugh kind of happens, that you really get lost in it. But there's just a specific thing he does that's just very unique to him, and you can't help but just sit back and watch it.
When you think back on the whole experience, what was the most memorable or interesting day or scene?
I mean, any of the drum stuff for me personally was such a discovery, because I'm gonna keep going with it. I haven't been as good at it, but sticking with it. But it just was such a visceral experience, and just I think trying to understand that drummers to some extent are like the hearts of a band. They set the tone, and it's like there's something very cathartic about banging on things that I would recommend to anybody. But I think there was a couple of things there with Lily that were very some of those back and forth scene that I felt we walked away from and went, okay, that was intense, but it was good, felt good.
And just one last question about, your career has been so interesting. You go back to things like the Gilmore Girls and Broadway, but then
you mean Gossip Girl? Yeah.
Yes, Gossip Girls.
Yeah.
And then Broadway, and then all of a sudden you're in this MCU universe. So what, for 10 plus years, what did that do for you? What did that do to your career? And what has that just meant to you?
It's huge. It's a huge piece of my life. Bucky Barnes and Marvel. They've really helped. I'm probably sitting here today. A lot of the credit goes to them for me sitting here talking to you today, because I think that I came in there and I really, at an early point in a very different way than Anthony Mackie or Jeremy Renner or Scarlett, people who had careers, extensive careers before, I think, where they went to Marvel. I was still really finding myself as I was going there, as we were starting, and very much growing up with them at the same time. But it's really interesting going back to playing a character over and over again over years as life changes and you're learning more. I just saw Top Gun last night, and I was like, it's just wild. There's, that just sort of revisit certain characters after you've experienced life, after you've gotten older. And so there's that piece. But I think, it's really allowed me to take some interesting creative choices, which is what I've always wanted to do. So I'm just always trying to kind of keep myself, on my toes, so to speak.
Well, yeah, you never know now when you're 60 years old, they might have something else for you if you're looking at Top Gun.
Oh my God. Yeah. Right. It just was wild. And also just, there's probably a time when it will have to come to an end. Obviously you're still thinking about like that Robert Downey Jr. scene at Endgame. Just still gets me a little bit, because you just, you've seen that guy for the last 10 years sort of take on that mantle. And so there's definitely something there.
Yeah. Well, Sebastian, congratulations on Pam and Tommy. It was
Thank you.
Such a great series. Best of luck to you, the entire cast and crew at this year's Emmy Awards. We hope to see all of you at that red carpet. To our viewers watching, head over to goldderby.com, make your awards predictions, beat our experts, and check out more interviews with top contenders. Sebastian, thanks for chatting with Gold Derby today.
Thank you so much, man. Have a good one. Thanks for having me.